Hello, everyone. Welcome to our event this evening. Around about 30 minutes later than planned. Apologies, we had some severe technical difficulties. This was working an hour ago when we were all here early. And the irony is we decided to host at Strathclyde because the IT at Glasgow was even worse. So there you go. My name is Ailey Jack. I'm the chair of the RSS local group for Glasgow. And we're delighted to be hosting an event today with the Celebrating Diversity Special Interest Group. Now, I'm just going to quickly pass over to Susie, who has some housekeeping, and then we'll get started with the talk. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ailey. My name's Susie, so I'm a member of staff here at Strathclyde. Just to let you all know, there's no planned fire drills this evening, so if the fire alarm goes off, we do need to evacuate the building. And at 6 o'clock, some of the internal doors will lock. Strange request, but if you need to go to the toilet, could you please ask me or another member of the team, because one of us will need to hold the door open so you can get back in. Not the actual cubicle door. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for coming to this event. It's an honor to be introducing Kevin Guyan to talk to us to the Celebrating Diversity's special interest group, but also to the Glasgow local group. Kevin Guyan is a writer and a researcher at the University of Edinburgh. He's working on exploring the intersection of data and identity with a particular focus on data practices that engage LGBTQ communities in the UK. He's the author of Queer Data, Using Gender, Sex and Sexuality Data for Action. And today he will give us insights on the findings from his book and further research. Thanks very much, Kevin.
I just hope I don't push anything to upset this. Okay. So hopefully everyone can hear me in the room, online. So yes, as Althea mentioned, I'm going to speak today about queer data, who counts, and thank you for the invitation to come and join you all today. It's lovely to be at Strathclyde. I'm going to speak for about 20-25 minutes. I think then we have time for questions and answers and discussions broadly on the theme of queer data. I'm going to be working on 2 laptops, so kind of excuse the DJ setup I've got going on here. So first of all, a little bit more about me and who I am. So although I spend a lot of my time speaking about quantitative data, a disclaimer, I am not a statistician, I'm not a mathematician, I'm not a data scientist. To be honest, I'm not really quite sure who I am or what I am. My background is a hot mix of my PhD was in history, I worked in a business school, before that I worked in a cultural studies department, all over the place. On the screen, I've shared some kind of recent work that I've been involved in. So up until earlier this year, I worked at the University of Glasgow on a project looking at gender equality policies in the film and TV industries of the UK, Canada, and Germany. Earlier this year, I joined the University of Edinburgh as a Chancellor's Fellow. And I think just about 10 days ago, I finished writing what's going to be my second book, which looks more broadly at intersections where LGBTQ lives meet classification and categorization practices, everything from hate crime reporting tools through to dating apps, border control, all of these spaces and places where queer lives rub up against different classification machines. I think common to all this work is the exploration of the intersection where LGBTQ lives meet different types of data practices. Who benefits and who loses when we collect, analyze, and present data about gender, sex, and sexuality? And how do the decisions that we make about what to count, how to count, and who to count, how do they have differential impacts on queer communities? Something I think is broken with our current approach to data practices and how they try to make sense of LGBTQ lives. Individuals leave behind a data trail of locations, contacts, tags, likes, and check-ins that create an evidence base about our gender, sex, and sexuality. But in the UK and around the world, I've picked out a few kind of recent headlines, this amassing of information is creating more flashpoints where LGBTQ lives rub up against different issues related to data. This problem is currently understood and presented to us as being about missing data and misrecognition. So when something goes wrong, it's seen as being the fault of tools and methods that are not accurate enough, they're not detailed enough, or they're hampered by biases or some kind of oversight in their design. These assumptions mean that people's gender, sex, sexuality, or relationship status is sometimes classified in ways that goes against how they might wish to identify. Now, while this happens in the tech world, it also happens offline, and we've seen recent debates around birth certificates, passports, ID documents, and this question of miscategorization or misrepresentation. So if that's kind of the common understanding of the problem, the response to that problem seems simple. We just add more LGBTQ people into these data systems. I'm sure everyone in the room and anyone joining online will be familiar with data projects that try to de-bias data systems or other diversity, equality, and inclusion initiatives. One high-profile example of plugging these historical gaps and adding more LGBTQ people into data systems is the national census. And this was kind of my gateway into the topic. As I mentioned, my background was in history, so I did a lot of work in archives with qualitative material, focus groups, interviews. About 4 or 5 years ago, pivoted to start looking at quantitative data, and the census in Scotland was really my way into this topic. So for anybody who was in Scotland in March 2022, you'll know that the census asked 2 new questions. One question on sexual orientation and one question on something described in the census as trans status or history. The census is really important for a number of reasons. It will help researchers and policymakers to create a national picture of Scotland's LGBTQ population and helps LGBTQ equality groups identify gaps, absences, and where best to target their support. I think also importantly, it challenges the assumption, the census has ran for over 200 years in Scotland. It challenges the assumption that everyone completing the census is both cisgender and straight. And for some, being counted in something like a census is affirmative and marks the pinnacle of queer inclusion and recognition by the state. And I think this important point, this idea of affirmation, of being affirmative, is actually really important. I think particularly with quantitative social scientists, it's sometimes lost that to see yourself in a census, in a survey, in a kind of data collection tool, it is meaningful to see yourself represented in these exercises. Now, I want to share, fingers crossed, this brief clip from a social media campaign I was involved in back in 2022 with the LGBTQ charity Scottish Trans. This was an online social media campaign that tried to get LGBTQ communities to be involved in the count and to kind of register themselves in the census. Let's see if the video works.
A lot of trans people hide, and necessarily so.
You can read it. I'm not going to touch anything here.
To come out trans, to actually be able to, if you can, to be able to stand up and go and be counted and be visible. I think visibility is one of the most important things in the kind of struggles we're having at the moment. Just to say to people, I'm just like you. I think this year's census is really important because lots of campaigning, pressure. We've actually managed to get questions about our identity, trans people, gay people. I think is brilliant because apart from anything else, it's very affirming. You actually feel you're part of the society that you live in. To get the ability to actually tick these boxes, I think it's brilliant. Looking forward to doing that part of it. We'll give it still.
So unfortunately, I couldn't hear Jacqueline's lovely Scottish accent, but you probably get the gist of what the video kind of highlights. That when you're brought into a system, it means you're no longer unspeakable. You become part of that data system's vocabulary. And I want you to keep these positives in mind, the kind of really positive story from Jacqueline, because as a warning, the rest of the talk is going to be all about the negatives, dangers, and the risks of being included and co-opted into these data systems. Because when we start to scratch the surface of something like a census, we see that this national data collection exercise was not as inclusive as we might first assume. So while the Scottish Census did have new questions on sexual orientation, on trans status or history, it continued to require all respondents to identify their sex as either male or female. For non-binary people who may not identify in this way, selecting a binary sex option was compulsory, with non-completion risking a fine of up to £1,000. And if there's any other census geeks in the room, next week, they are publishing the data for Scotland on the 27th of June for sexual orientation and for trans status at 9 a.m., 9:30 a.m. So this will be a really exciting moment, headline data on the numerical size of Scotland's LGBTQ population. But as I will come to the rest of the talk, politicized, contested, take this quantitative data with a grain of salt. Because while some LGBTQ people are counted in Scotland's census, the design of data collection tools ensures that particular characteristics or particular ways of thinking about identity remain designed out of the process. So what does the census tell us? Well, as I mentioned, we don't yet know for Scotland. We'll find out next week, but we do know for England and Wales, who shared their data in January of last year. So for England and Wales, 3.2% of the population identified as LGBT+, and 0.5% said that their current gender was different from their sex as registered at birth. There was happy to my percentage sign there. Now, as I mentioned, it's been a few years since the count in England, a couple of years in Scotland, and things haven't turned out exactly as planned. The collection of more data about LGBTQ lives invites new risks. Across the UK, census data about the size of the LGBTQ population, particularly the number of trans people, has become politicized in ways that serves interests of those opposed to LGBTQ equalities. I think these examples, these headlines, go to show that adding a greater diversity of people into a data system is not the same as querying a system. So reviewing its rules, its regulations, locating what is broken, and discarding the parts that are beyond repair. So today in my talk, I want to share an alternate account of the problem and how we as researchers, as practitioners, can lead a new wave of solutions. This new plan of action comes from my book, Queer Data, which builds upon the work of some amazing scholars, activists, and practitioners. And in Queer Data, I describe this concept as consisting of two strands. So firstly, the first strand is data about LGBTQ communities. And the second strand is asking questions about or querying the methods we use to collect, analyze, and present all types of data, whether or not it relates to gender, sex, and sexuality. Now, I'm not going to go through these in detail, but you'll be more familiar with the first strand of Queer Data, some kind of headline figures there around the kind of composition of LGBTQ people across health, education, population data, for example. There's also a lot of stuff missing though, but I want you to think before jumping to go and plug data gaps or kind of fill what's kind of missing in this data, we need to think critically about whether a lack of data actually matters. And if we do go out and choose to plug any data gaps, how do we do this in ways that engage queer communities, that are non-extractive, and actually make a positive difference? When I do these talks, I try and do some homework. I try and dig out some kind of local data. There we go. Some local data. I wasn't able to dig out anything around RSS and sexual orientation, on gender identity. I zoomed out, had a little look at some stuff more broadly in the field that many of us are working in around kind of UKRI data. They're doing a little bit more year on year to kind of share their data, make it more transparent. Some really alarming stats from my research yesterday, and one on the left-hand side around the kind of gender breakdown and people being awarded grants by the EPSRC. You'll be familiar with this type of data about marginalized and minoritized communities. Yes, more examples there. Again, LGBTQ data seems to be a bit of a hot topic at the moment, both in the UK and the US, particularly in STEM fields, a growing movement to collect more and more data about sexual orientation. I think there's some positives there, but there's also some risks and some dangers in this move to collect more data about these communities. The second strand, I think, is more interesting. And this is the second strand of queer data. This is asking questions about how we queer the methods we use in our collection, analysis, and presentation of data. By asking questions about methods, we move our focus to start thinking about the politics, the history, and the power of policymakers, practitioners, and researchers. So we're moving our lens away from the kind of community under investigation to instead thinking about those responsible for collecting and gathering the data. So my argument here is that our current account of the problem is wrong. So if you think back to this idea of misrecognition or missing data, that current account of the problem is wrong. And instead, we need to think about about whether our data practices are actually operating exactly as designed. And the problem, in fact, relates to the role the data practices play in shaping how we all make sense of our identity. Now, wait, I'm sure many people are thinking, kind of, what do you mean that data shapes our identity, that collecting data about sexuality shapes who we are? I'm not going to take us too far down this philosophical path, but I want you to think how data plays a role in authorizing the existence of different types of communities, whether it's options you see on a website drop-down menu or the boxes offered in a national census. So I want you to think about, rather than what data excludes or restricts, think about data's generative or productive powers in what the data tools, methods, approaches we use bring into being. So as I said, I'm not going to kind of get too philosophical, conceptual here. There's a whole body of work in this space, but I want us to think about data practices as descriptions of the world versus data practices as something that produces the world around us. And what might this kind of reorientation of data mean for LGBTQ communities? I'm going to share 2 or 3 quotes to illustrate this idea in more detail. Firstly, the scholars Paisley Curra and Susan Stryker, and they describe how the enumerative process, so the act of counting something, has the capacity to create what it purports only to name. So when you go out and count something, you're actually producing and generating ideas about the thing that you're counting. Secondly, another fantastic quote from a scholar that I return to time and time again, the US-based activist and academic Dean Spade, who also writes on how administrative systems invent and produce meanings for the categories that they administer. And I'll give you a few seconds to read that quote. And I think I have a 3rd slide, let's just see. Yes, I do. Fantastic. And my kind of 3rd and final shout out is for the equally amazing Sarah Ahmed and her writing on diversity work and complaint in institutions like universities. Across several of her books, Ahmed builds on the idea of the performative, building on people like Judith Butler, in which saying something brings the thing you name into existence. So I sentence you to 10 years in prison, I pronounce you married. And turning this idea to quality, diversity, and inclusion practices, Ahmed writes, I came to ask whether there's investment in both law and policy as something performative, as if they do what they say, as if they bring something into existence. So this got me thinking, kind of bringing us back to data, bringing us back to quantitative data. What happens when we apply this idea of the performative to something like the publication of LGBTQ hate crime statistics? We're forced to ask new questions as to whether the data describes a pre-existing problem, or if in the act of collecting, analyzing, and presenting LGBTQ hate crime data, we're actually producing what is meant by a hate crime and who counts as LGBTQ. This is the kind of line of work that my kind of work's moving in that we tell a different story about that interaction between LGBTQ lives and data. So while acknowledging that it can do some good, I'm not necessarily calling for more or better or more detailed data. My work doesn't really focus on calling for more regulation or more anti-bias initiatives. I want us to move us away from language that positions LGBTQ communities as being vulnerable or being at risk. Instead, I want us to go deeper and rethink how our engagement with data practices changes and shapes who we are. So I've spoken a lot about theory, about concepts, and the kind of tail end of my talk, I want to pivot and think about the practical applications of these ideas in our day-to-day work and research. So to do that, I'm going to share 3 big queer questions, which each have queer tips, kind of take-home ideas on how you might apply some of this queer data approaches in your own research and practice. So question number 1, a question we should all be asking: do you actually need more data? I'm sure many in the room will have heard the demand that we need more data, particularly anybody in the space who's done any type of diversity and inclusion work. This idea that we need more and more data about more and more intersectional data, more disaggregated data, more kind of granular data, this call for we need more data. And while quantitative and qualitative data can do some good, it's not going to solve all of our problems. You might have guessed from my kind of tone so far that I don't believe the kind of gathering more and more data is going to address some of these structural systemic issues in research and higher education and other sectors, industries. Writing about data on racial injustice in the US, there we go, the sociologist Ruha Benjamin argues that the problem is not a lack of knowledge, and that actually demanding data on subjects such as kind of racially minoritized communities or LGBTQ groups is actually a perversion of knowledge. So, as I said, I'm going to conclude each queer question with a queer data tip. And my first queer data tip is just to kind of pause before you go to jump and plug any data gaps. And think how whether or not kind of plugging gaps, plugging absences will necessarily benefit all LGBTQ people. Question number 2. Ask if you need to be out to be counted by data practices. So positioned at the intersection of data and identity is the thorny question of disclosure and the contexts that make it possible or impossible to share an authentic account of your life and experiences. Many data systems can only make sense of LGBTQ individuals who are out in some shape or form. It might be ticking a box in a survey, it might be disclosing that in a staff diversity monitoring form. There's some act of outing yourself to the data system, to the data tool. Now, while this requirement for outness might seem inclusive, it might seem progressive, outness is not desirable nor possible for everyone. I'm not going to go too much into this example. This is from my previous work, kind of what introduced me to this kind of idea of disclosure. This is from the BBC, and type of stuff you'll be familiar with, diversity monitoring targets, where there's kind of data on the current composition of the workforce, and then the BBC had a target for what it hoped to achieve in a year's time. And this is common across many sectors, many industries. In an organization like the BBC, you see that actually these diversity targets had a problem. That actually, when compared with census data, there was an overrepresentation of LGBTQ plus staff working at the BBC. We actually see this with some other diversity characteristics where these targets benchmarked against the working population, against census data, didn't add up. So what did the BBC do? Well, they pivoted their approach, they changed their approach, and in their most recent diversity and inclusion plan have moved to something I describe as an outness target. By that, I mean that the BBC's kind of KPI, their metric for success on a year-by-year basis, is for 50% of their LGBTQ plus staff to be out at work. Now, in my view, this approach, this outness target, is misguided and advances an assumption that all employees should be out in all situations in the workplace. This blanket view fails to consider different vulnerabilities, cements a linear notion of change, and places too much emphasis on visibility. So my hope is that other employers, organizations don't look to the BBC and go, actually, we're going to change our staff diversity targets to start kind of having outness metrics where we need more and more staff, LGBTQ staff, to be out to hit that target. I think that would be a step in the wrong direction. So my queer data tip number 2, it sounds counterproductive, but we need to proactively assert how data about LGBTQ communities is partial and only presents one account of the world around us. And we'll see this next week with publication of census data in Scotland around the LGBTQ, the size of the LGBTQ community. We will have, I can guarantee you now, right-wing media saying the number is too high. But in my view, it's also an undercount. There's many people for a variety of reasons who will not have disclosed information. It was a voluntary question for a start about their sexual orientation or their trans status. So it's both going to be an undercount and an overcount at the same time. And that's how this kind of data it's political, it's historical, and it engages ideas of power. Third and final queer question. It's a bit controversial, but it asks, is it always good to be included? I want us to think what it actually means when we talk about inclusion in data and what's understood as possible and impossible when we pursue this agenda as our main ambition. Now, this is a slide I like to share because it shows that inclusion is just one concept in a broader landscape of diversity, equality, and inclusion ideas, concepts, methods. Inclusion can be an endpoint, or the goal of inclusion can be a stepping stone towards something bigger, like justice or liberation. And although data practices are not often mentioned in this space, the dangers of queer inclusion has a long history that dates back to at least the early 2000s, and critiques of LGBT rights campaigns that prioritize entry into institutions like the police, border control, global finance, and the armed forces. So my argument here is that inclusion in data systems, inclusion in data practices, marks a new frontier in a longer history of co-opting queer lives into contested systems, institutions, and established ways of working. The tech scholar Anna Lauren Hoffman writes how more inclusive data sets and data input fields celebrate narrow technical updates as victories for marginalized communities. So as Hoffman writes, these kind of inclusive DEI initiatives can give the impression that a problem is under control and excuse the underlying systemic and structural factors that continue to operate unchecked. Ultimately, my argument is that being included is simply not enough. So finally, my queer data tip number 3, pay attention to what alternative paths an inclusive approach prevents from happening. Sometimes a solution that gives the suggestion of action precludes more meaningful work from taking place. So keeping focus on the practical, I want to kind of pool these threads together and ask one big final question. Where do we go from here? I want us to reflect on whether our existing data practices, tools, and methods are worth fixing. We might come to realize that our current ways of working have inequality and exploitation baked into their design, and that no matter how hard we try, they simply can't be fixed to build a better world for everyone. If we arrive at that conclusion, this leaves us with one other option, and that is abolition. We face a situation where two paths lie ahead. Whether we dedicate our energy as researchers, as practitioners, to fixing data practices in need of repair, or take things apart and build something new in its place. When we stop trying to fix things, this requires a radical rethink of our relationship to data systems. By saying no to the choices presented to us, we're not just being awkward, difficult, or to paraphrase Sarah Ahmed, a killjoy, but we're challenging the narrow options that are presented to us as possible. In all honesty, I don't yet know the best path to follow, or if we have to choose one path. I do a lot of these talks across universities, industry, business, and for now, my focus is kind of developing that resilience, that ability for institutions to push back against an increasing tide of anti-LGBTQ attacks, including in the data space, lots of efforts to try and restrict, exclude, tighten data categories, boxes, definitions, to exclude particularly trans and non-binary people. And that's been the focus of my work in the past few years. To bring things to a conclusion, why does any of this matter? Well, to be the kind of killjoy to party, when we talk about inclusive approaches to data, we have to think about the good and the bad. Applying a queer lens to data practices poses fundamental questions about the relationship between data and identities. This new approach also requires us to ask some different questions about how we use data in our work. The design of data practices don't arrive with us as some sort of ahistorical or apolitical artifact. They don't simply collect data about the outside world that's sitting static, ready to be collected. Rather, the data practices that we use across all disciplines, all subjects, they're crafted, tweaked, and changed to serve the particular interests of individuals, organizations, and ways of working. I don't yet know the answers to these big questions, but I hope that thinking about the intersection between data and identity sparks new and bigger questions about how we produce knowledge and hopefully change the world for the better. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kevin. I'm just going to kind of stand somewhat awkwardly here in front of the
I might change the slide
laptop
so
so
it's hypnotic. There we go.
there we go. Awesome. Yeah, really a lot for us all to think about there. Now we are going to have some time for audience questions. We are going to do those offline for the sake of privacy. But just to start us off, I've got a couple of kind of talking points here, so I should introduce myself as well. I'm Liam Briley. I'm one of the committee members of the RSS Celebrating Diversity SIG, let's call it. So Kevin, you mentioned quite a lot there the Scottish census data. So have you got any kind of expectations for what we might see come out of that in the next week, particularly compared to the equivalent data in England and Wales?
I have some predictions, some ideas. So yeah, it comes out next Thursday. I think there'll be a few things. I'm kind of trying to work through this current. I've written a kind of blog piece I'm going to publish next week around. I'm currently calling it Goldilocks data. By that I mean data that's kind of too hot, too cold. It's never quite right, and I think that's the situation with data on the size of the LGBTQ population in Scotland. For anti-LGBTQ groups, it's going to both be too big and too small at the same time. So I think how we respond to that is important. We can't play by the rules of the game that they're setting out in terms of trying to find that golden statistic or that golden number, or if only the response rate was 2% higher, then everyone would be satisfied. We need to avoid getting bogged down in that kind of logic, that type of thinking. And actually, I think more kind of try and own that this data is political, this data is historical, this data is peppered with gaps and absences, but actually that's not a problem. That actually acknowledges that people have messy, complicated, nuanced lives, and actually we're never going to have a data set that's perfect. And I don't think that's something we should strive for. So that's one thing I'm going to be watching. The other thing, just out of this is a real geekish thing, but the question for gender identity was different in England, Wales, and in Scotland. So in Scotland, as I shared earlier, pull the slide up, they asked something called a trans status history question. Let's go back a wee bit. There we go. Yeah, trans status or history question. To basically measure how many people identify as trans in Scotland. As a design of question, this is actually quite trailblazing, quite outlandish. I haven't seen this really anywhere else in the world. Whereas the question in England and Wales was more typical, is your current gender the same as your sex as registered at birth? There's been some issues around the possible comprehension of that question. And I think there is some validity in kind of probing whether people understood that question. I find that kind of, is your gender the same as your sex registered at birth, yes or no, actually quite hard to follow. I think this is maybe a more clear to the point question. But something like a census, you have to remember, probably about 99% of the population are cisgender. So actually you need to design a question that works, that's comprehensible for people who don't identify in that way. Similar thing for the sexual orientation question. Again, unless I'm totally surprised, the majority of people in Scotland will identify as straight or heterosexual. So again, you need to devise a question that captures that broader information while the group sizes are very different, which will be interesting to see.
So would you expect different response rates then for this question versus the equivalent one in England and Wales?
The census in Scotland took place a year after the English and Welsh census as well. They did have challenges getting their response rate up, more so than the English and Welsh census. If anybody was in Scotland at the time, you might remember there was a few court cases as well happening, both in Scotland and England and Wales around the sex question. So it became a political issue, which may encourage people to respond or may discourage people to respond. So we don't know. It'll be interesting if the numbers map up, exactly the same as England and Wales, or whether there's any discrepancies. We'll see. I know for England and Wales, they actually produced some really exciting graphs. You can kind of zoom in quite kind of small areas of England and Wales and see the kind of breakdown of sexual orientation and gender identity. It'll be interesting to see how that plays, if they do something similar in Scotland, and how that plays out in terms of the geographical spread of this data.
Yeah, I remember we all spent a long time sort of fiddling through those.
Yeah, it's great.
Looking at the fascinating details. Yeah. And the another thing that I was interested in, I mean, you mentioned your background is in history, right? So are there any kind of, I suppose, landmark historical moments for past instances of the kind of concept that you mentioned of data generation or data recording shaping people's identity?
Yeah, I mean, maybe in a really my PhD, my background is in modern British history. I'd like 1950s architecture and planning. So if anyone wants to chat to me about post-war planning design, I can also have a side kind of talk on that. Like I did a piece for LGBT History Month maybe last year or 2 years ago, like a thing for the conversation. And I actually thought, okay, I'm going to just write about the history of particularly sexual orientation data, particularly data on gay men, kind of what quantitative data exists in the archive. So I'll have a look online, see what's out there. Unsurprisingly, it's all awful. Like when the quantitative data was collected about gay men, it was always around criminality, criminal records. It was around psychological deviance. It was around being abnormal. The actual existing historical data on these communities is extremely one-sided. It does not paint the full picture or diversity of people's lives. And I think that probably has some contemporary effects in terms of whether it's large language models, whether it's AI, when they're using these existing data sets to kind of fill the machine. Most of this data is awful. It's horrific data. It's about criminality and deviance. So again, kind of how are our contemporary data machines being shaped by these existing historical data sets? And I think there would have been something, like I'm interested in this kind of the looping effects of how data shapes who we are. And there would have been something in actually this collection of quantitative data, maybe telling some gay men that they were deviant, they were criminals when they were exposed to these types of data, these data sets. I think this presentation of whether it's hate crime data, again, if you're seeing a lot of hate crime data, you come to see yourself as a potential hate crime victim. And this kind of looping effect between the presentation of data and how it shapes who we are, I think has a longer historical arc.
Fascinating.
Well, it's teaser for the new book. The new book is looking more into that space around this kind of looping effects of kind of Boker and Starr in hacking and science and technology studies, and how our engagement with data changes who we are. So that's teaser for the second book.
Excellent. Because I mean, I was just about to ask you about what we can kind of expect from the second book, Rainbow Trap, isn't it?
Yes, I finished writing it about 2 weeks ago. It's going to come out June next year, so a year from now, and it looks like a horizontal sweep of 6 different data systems or kind of classification machines. It looks across hate crime reporting, border control. So how do you prove that you are LGBTQ, an LGBTQ asylum seeker? What kind of data do you use to kind of prove to the Home Office there's that type of information? Dating apps is a really kind of easy example. Health and fitness apps, all of these data tools, how do they shape and inform our sense of gender, sex, and sexuality? Yeah, coming out next June, Rainbow Trap.
Excellent. We'll look forward to it. Now, I'm sure you're all dying to ask Kevin some questions, but there's one last thing that I need to do, which is to thank everybody who has joined online. We're going to close the live stream now, but this video will be available to watch back. And we hope to see you again, either online, in person, or at another RSS Celebrating Diversity event, or another RSS Glasgow local group event. So thanks for joining.
Thank you.